size only. It's got to give you that, okay? Oh, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Julie Taylor. I'm very happy to welcome all of you in Thayer Hall and you in live streaming land to Architecture Unbound. First, I'd like to thank our co-presenters, AIA and the Colburn School, for their wonderful support and generosity. Today's panel needs practically no introduction. Architects Tom Main, Craig Hodges, and Scott Johnson, who are all AIA Fellows, as well as AIA LA Gold Medalists. And their firms have designed, some of the most significant projects in LA and throughout the world. Joseph Giovannini is the author of this book, which will continue to be on sale after the talk, and he'll be outside signing them, and we'll have a little reception. So now I'll leave you in the hands of our moderator, Greg Golden. He's the former architecture critic at Los Angeles Magazine and co-curator and co-author of the Never Built series, the latest of which will be the Faden Atlas of Never Built Architecture, covering 400 unbuilt projects on 7 continents. Take it away, Rick.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out on a nice summer day. For those of us who are natives of LA, we like this kind of a day. Be at the beach, go for a hike, but you guys came indoors to the Colburn, so we want to wish you a fond welcome and try to dive right in to our discussion of Joseph's impressive book, Architecture Unbound, where, there's that canard that goes, what, don't judge a book by its cover? But in this case, I think it is fair to do so, and also partly because of the way that it's trimmed. I don't know if you can see from here, you'll see this book is tilting, which I think is part of the subject that we're going to address today, and its subhead is A Century of Disruptive Avant-Garde Architecture, which he says is transgressive, oblique, aberrant, interesting word, deconstructed, digital, and how many other words in here, Joseph, adjectives to describe the architecture that I hope we're going to touch on at the very least, because at 800 pages we're not getting through it all. Those are words: angular, idiosyncratic, aposty, tilting, imbalance, liquefaction, unpredictability, inclined, expressionist, nonlinear, oblique, aberrant again, and deconstructed and digital. So, Joseph, what are you talking about? What is this avant-garde?
Well, as some of you may know, I coined the term deconstructivism a long time ago in '87. And I had noticed that a number of architects were interested both in deconstruction and constructivism, some interested in both, some in one, some in the other, some in neither. And as I poked around a bit, I realized that a lot of architects were absorbing thought systems that were not strictly architectural. And so for me, the term deconstructivism was an intersection of two thought systems, deconstruction and constructivism. But I thought of that as emblematic of other architects who were interested in performance or art or chaos science. And so it's a self-conflicted term, meaning that neither is dominant, but it implies that there are various systems intersecting, sort of what Foucault thought of as thought systems, basically. So among the architects I've written about, almost all of them have invited some other thought system into a purely architectural system. So that they kick architecture to the side into territory that's kind of new and fresh.
And where did that take us? Because I think where you begin with the book is with architecture that is saying to the world, modernism is no longer going to be the language of architecture. We're not going to be living according to the dictates of Mies van der Rohe and nice rectilinear orthogonal buildings that are built on a scaffold of steel and clad in glass. That the world needs to be upended, which I think to some extent represents the work of the architects who we're sitting with here today. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I
No,
would just
Scott,
offer
dive right in.
My reading of Joseph's book is it wasn't particularly exclusive of one thing or another. It was actually inclusive. It was really an expansion of the idea of modern, not capital M modern, to say that, you know, we've written or we have a received history about what modern architecture is, and I'll be simplistic and post-Bauhausian, you know, Cartesian, orthogonal, the things you were talking about. But in fact, there were other things happening. And sometimes they were below the horizon, and then at some point they were visible, and at perhaps in the last period of time, they're more than visible. They've entered the mainstream in a lot of ways. I think that what's interesting to me about Joseph's book is that, and maybe it took 800 pages to achieve this, but it's both very high-minded about the big themes of architecture of the last 100 years, and it is an expansion of what institutionally was thought to be modern, in my view. But it's also very interesting as an anecdotal thread, because he talks a lot about being in certain places, and I think we were chatting a little bit before we came out here. Each of us was in some of those places. You know, we're not 20 years old anymore, and we were in some of those places when some of these things were happening. And my reading, and he touches in the beginning and the middle and the end on some of my background, seems pretty true to form from my own personal experience.
But he did connect the dots from all the way back with, you know, the Russian constructivists, the Götternaeum, things that you wouldn't imagine were happening in a time frame which was common to them. Because you imagine people were getting on trains, taking days and days to get somewhere, and at the same time that vibe, whatever that vibe was, that's what I think Joseph was able to kind of put his finger on, was to trace what was a gestalt, a kind of, I don't know what you call it.
A spirit, perhaps?
That was kind of erupting at different places, perhaps because of social context or whatever, but there was definitely a kinship between a lot of those things. And I have to thank you for putting them all together. So, you know, there was an understanding that these things were gathering momentum. They were beginning to, you know, give off sparks. And then, you know, finally coalesced in what we're seeing today. I mean, I think it's quite extraordinary, and the book is a great gift to help us understand that.
No, what is interesting is you can't make a singular set of comments about the people in this book. Those of you that have seen it, I spent the day yesterday just kind of moving through it. It's a big book. It takes you a good part of the day just to do
Takes a
this.
week.
And actually, obviously I looked at it before, but it has struck me what kind of what a monumental 5 decades it's been. The amount of work and the number of kind of questions being asked and the directions being taken are just, it's jaw-dropping, right? But then I want to go back to your comment or the first about disruption. And that includes quite a bit of differences between these people, because I was never interested in disruption. I'm interested in connection. I'm interested in agency at a political, cultural, social level, and bringing architecture into the 21st century, right? Not disrupting, so we have enough disruption in our life. But it was also very much part, and it was seen as resistance to the found thing, for sure. It was part of a time that you would say was common to anybody within the creative territory. If you looked at film, I'm talking now about the 70s and 80s when this thing took off. It was an unusual kind of period of time. And we were chatting beforehand, and whether it's a Laurie Anderson, whether it's painters that are not going to paint anymore, but they're going to move dirt, a Heiser, whether it's music, go to Davis, go to Hendrix, wherever you want to go to theater, everywhere. There was a discussion of a radical shift that was somehow just about parallel to the beginning of the 20th century. You could look at it in the 20s, right? And in fact, all of us were peeking in, and we're very kind of aware of the history of architecture, and it would be Corbusier and Mies and the major kind of figures. But we're looking at the Spitters and the Duchamps and the beginning of a complete different thinking, which we were absolutely believed in, And if there was any maybe commonality, we were discussing this, a group of us share here, was an incredible naivete. We actually believed that architecture would shape behavior and could change the nature of
Well,
who we
people
are
are
as a
following
culture.
their star. I don't think it was, this is the one quibble I kind of have with the idea of deconstructing, because I think everybody was being constructive. They were following their own individual stars, just as the Laurie Andersons and people were. They had a native creative urge to go in a certain direction, but I don't think, it seems to me it was not a matter of trying to put down or to destroy the precedents. It was building upon, as Tom was saying.
You know, let me read you something that Joseph writes in the book, because in the book, it really, as Tom was saying and you were saying, it goes back to not just the Russian Revolution, but to the antecedents to that of modernist writing and James Joyce. And the book, without charting that chronologically, we find the sort of lineage in the work you're talking about, which is very separate work. But then there's this moment, I think, maybe I'm wrong, you guys can correct me, and it happens in Paris in 1968, when suddenly it feels as if the world really is going to change, but not in the conventional ways that we think about change, or people were taught to think about change. It wasn't going to be some sort of, communist revolution and from the top down this would happen. No, people were going to be at the barricades, and something was going to come from the bottom up. And I think that's what you were talking about, Tom. And maybe I'm wrong, but that one had the sense of possibility.
You sound like Rem now. I'm tired of hearing about 1968 in Paris. I had no clue. Did I have some clue it was taking place? I probably was reading the papers. It was taking place here. When I'm at USC as a student, they're taking over the streets, and I have to go past tanks to get to my apartment. It was already a set of conditions, and for me anyway, and I would think a lot of the characters I was around, it was very much local. And for me, the Paris thing came 10 years later.
I was in Paris in '68, Tom.
Yeah, okay, so we obviously didn't talk.
That's why
No,
he
but
has
the
it in
point
the book.
I think it's much more than a kind of a single event. And,
Yeah,
and
I just
think
mean
it would
that's
get back to-
emblematic of
It'd get back
what was
to
happening.
Los Angeles, how Los Angeles belongs in this book. Because I would have said there were definitely two places that this is happening, and it was in New York and it was in Los Angeles. And there was a huge connection between those taking place parallel to the Paris stuff.
And how would you characterize that? Because we're speaking in very broad terms here, but what did that mean when you sat down to sketch, to draw, to think about what sort of work was going to emerge out of this moment that for you guys is the beginning?
Do I see
Well, I
it
think
before
maybe
you?
the basic thing that was going on in terms of people's consciousness was to begin to challenge hierarchy, to begin to challenge top-down systems of government, systems of,
And authority.
and authority, exactly. And the architecture of, the Palladio and so forth reinforced the idea of hierarchy. You sort of inflected when you were entering those
It's always
grand
telling you where to
doors.
go.
Yeah, and I think the thing that happened almost in a natural way, in an evolutionary way, was to find that architecture, classical architecture, modern architecture, was a participant in creating that kind of genuflection
Directive.
and directing the conversation. And I think in bits and pieces, people began to challenge their own design sensibility and say, wait a minute, this ought to be more open. This ought to be more accessible.
You were asking how you responded. I thought we were going to say the same thing. We took it for granted.
Oh, absolutely.
We
What
went
do
to
you-
the
what do you
film,
mean, Tom,
and it
we
was
took it for granted?
Antonioni or Godard
Yeah.
or Truffaut.
That's right.
We went to the movies. And I make no connection in my life right now if that was a monumental thing, other than I stood in line at some weird theater and saw that, and that's just what you did. And again, you listen to music and you're hanging out and you listen to talking heads, you listen to whoever the hell you listen to, when they weren't known. When they were just like blabbing around and people were going, that's interesting. We've got some kind of unique person. And then we were discussing earlier in Venice, Doug Christmas is putting a big rock in the Bank of America that's Heiser, right? And it's just like kind of interesting. and you live across the street and go, this is kind of interesting, does it affect you? Of course it, it kind of forms like, this is kind of what I do as a creative person, forget an architect. Ooh, and architecture was an art form. Architecture was an art form. That can't be understated, because I would have said that it wouldn't be the notion of the average citizen in this country or this city.
Yeah, so I'll pile on a little bit there. It's easy to see things.
Let me interrupt. Scott is the only one here, other than me, who's read the whole book, 800 pages. So
Yes.
And he did
Give him a round of applause.
He did it in a week. You have to. I'm
Craig
sorry, I
has,
stand
see?
corrected. I sit corrected.
And you all will when you buy it after
Craig
this
also.
event. But, you know, my only two beefs about the book would be that it's too heavy to go on my carry-on on the airplane.
Yes.
So it sits there next to the Old Testament, the other 800-page book, and the Webster Dictionary, which nobody uses anymore. We Google things, right? So kind of I have to be home to look at it and read it, but I have read it. And there's so much to say about it, really. But yeah, it's weird to say you had to be there, but actually what these gentlemen are saying is true. If you were there, you weren't looking back at it, you were just in it, you were swimming in it. In 1970, when we decided there was a moratorium and we shouldn't be bombing Cambodia, we just decided we wouldn't go to our classes. So the professors would show up, we weren't there. And then we had to invent our projects because the professor, we didn't need him anymore, we were gonna figure it out. And we're gonna present to each other. And he wanted to come see, so he could come see if he wanted, we didn't really care, right? Right. We didn't think we were part of some huge thing, we just did that. The other thing about Joseph's book, and I have to get this out, is that if you think architecture is about construction, you won't be interested in his book. If you think it's about sustainability and resource management, you won't be interested in his book. If you think it's about client identity or program, you're probably not interested. What it appears to me that Joseph has done is he's positioned what's happened with architecture and the definition of modernism or contemporary work, whatever you choose to call it, as a metaphoric enterprise, which is to say it has meaning principally because it's related to other cultural things that are happening, and therefore it's part of a zeitgeist, and it may be delayed. In fact, I think he makes a pretty good case that, you know, in 1905, Braque and Picasso started doing Cubism, Cézanne died, Einstein wrote the general theory of relativity. Well, that was 120 years ago, and it's taken a while for whatever inertia is implied with architecture to get to that kind of disruptive 4th, 5th, 11th dimension thinking to sort of begin to do that, but you can't isolate architecture in his reading and in his writing. It's a metaphor of these other things, and it draws meaning. That's not to say that every architect draws on theory to justify his work, but there's enough of it going on that it's a metaphor of many other things, and you can really get a deeper reading in what architecture can be if you understand that. That's a tool.
Well, relative to that delay, I think it took a long time for architectural and architects to embrace a larger cultural kind of realm because they were kind of focused and kind of enclosed within a tradition. And the minute, as Tom says, the minute you encounter a Laurie Anderson,
What do you do with that? Right?
what do you do with that? And what does that do to your appreciation of music or
Really, you still go to Lincoln Center if Laurie's playing this crazy violin?
Exactly. And so it really is something that I think acted internally upon individual people's consciousness rather than being top down in terms of you shall do this. In fact, Joseph points out, and I think you really rightly take Arthur Drexler to task and Philip Johnson to task for their proposition about the deconstructivist show, which was trying to manage it in the old way of packaging something when it refuses to be packaged. Well, it is in 800 pages, but
No, he really misunderstood it altogether because they were doing it before he died. He was very old, and they wanted the last show was going to make a difference, and it would. So he was just the wrong person to understand it because I know personally he told me that the point is to simplify it for general consumption So, and he was a formalist as well, so he only saw it formally. And to your point, Scott, that architecture has come into, is now operating, in this case, in a much larger cultural field, and it's not dissociated. One of the problems in our time was in some way breaking away from the Bauhaus, which everybody loves, but it came with a price. It was about functionalism as derived from the machine production. Architecture was a machine for living in. And so breaking that functionalist mold was extremely important and very, very difficult because it had become a mantra that form follows function. I take the book, this is a book within a book, which is one of the reasons it's so long. I wrote it from 88 through 92, and my then editor decided that I should put this whole capacious subject in chronological order, which was really not possible, first of all, because it was all about nonlinearity. So I understood that she didn't get the book, and so we said goodbye, put it on the shelf. And then my wife and I moved, and I took it off the shelf, sat down with it, and I thought, oh, this is really pretty interesting. But a lot had happened in the 20 years since, and so I realized if I wanted to revive the book, I had to bring it forward into, deeply into the 21st century, but also to take it back to its origins. And it took me into the 19th century when mathematicians were challenging Euclidean geometry, particularly, the one, there were three particularly, Lobachevsky, a German fellow whose name I can't remember, and Poincaré, the Frenchman who was exploring topographies, and he says, well, a triangle on a flat sheet of paper is one thing, but if you draw a triangle on an orange, then it's a different triangle. So there are other geometries than the Euclidean. And so that leads to, the fourth dimension. The Russians are interested in other dimensions of space. Dostoevsky writes in The Brothers Karamazov that he's really the first deconstructivist writer. He says, he has one brother, Karamazov, telling another, how can you understand Godhead, infinity, with a Euclidean mindset? You have to understand space in other dimensions where parallel lines cross. So that leads to, Einstein and the artists are breaking down perspectival space. Philosophers after Nietzsche are doubting fixed truths, and that gets into relativities of understanding. So you have art, philosophy, science, and then later the two world wars and all the disasters of the 20th century that are really breaking apart the classical world, the notion of fixity, axes, and all the kind of authoritarian architecture that you felt perfectly comfortable with. I'm just back from Paris, and it's quite wonderful to be in a building that tells you where to go, but this architecture is not about that. So Virginia Woolf writes in 1910 that the world has changed. There are so many fundamental shifts that arts have to change, the novel has to change, and indeed it does. Everything, there's a white-hot period from about 2010, 12 through the middle of the 20s when the arts are just convulsive, and Freud is entering the art conversation, Virginia Woolf writes an interior novel, and of course James Joyce shifts the subject from narrative to language, so I take that as a point of departure and relate it to 1983, at which point Lyotard in France is writing about basically postmodern, not postmodernist, but a postmodern condition in which the whole foundation of the Bauhaus, for example, and modernism in general has shifted because there's a huge amount of doubt, and certainly, anyway, the point is, in the 70s and 80s, it's a reprise of what happened in the 20s, and indeed, a lot of these architects are looking back at suprematism, constructivism, expressionism that had been more or less superseded by Bauhaus, which is a very restrictive kind of architectural ideology, is machine-based, and even within the Bauhaus, it had an expressionist section which was basically drummed out by the machinists or the industrial people, and so everything became Euclidean and stamped out industrial and functionalist. And so that in the 70s and 80s, that whole hegemony of the Bauhaus is now questioned as a lot of people go back and look at this, the foundational, different foundations in the context of new thinking, which is, whether Laurie Anderson is multiplying herself. She's kind of an explosive presence because she's on screen, her voice changes, the instrument she's playing is not the instrument you're hearing, and it multiplies, it just fractionalizes in a really fascinating way, and that happens in architecture. Or it could be John Cage, who's no longer narrative, there's no arc, he does things discreetly, sound is sound, bing, bing, there's nothing tying it together. The book itself is, can you show the cover?
Yeah, and then I'm going to ask, because, there's the book. What did you want to see here, Joseph?
Oh, just the cover is fine.
Well,
It's a good
it's up on
exercise.
the piano. It's hard to lift.
Yeah, it's a good, it's a good exercise. The
Yes, it
collateral
is.
benefit is.
Get those back.
Yes, you need the little rolly thing. Well,
Can I say what he said a different way?
yeah, because I want to bring it
A
back to
lot
the buildings.
happened in the first half of the 20th century, artistically, and a huge amount of it hadn't yet been internalized within the discipline of architecture. And then with that, there was a connecting the dots. I was impressed when I was looking at the book yesterday. You gave a lot of space to a guy named Claude Perron, very interesting French architect, and to Guto Domenic, a very kind of esoteric to most people architect, happened to be people that I knew. And as I realized I knew them, I'm going, what is a common denominator in this book? There was a huge amount of connection globally. So not only are we connecting dots historically in the first half of the century, which is monumental, the amount of stuff that took place, it still isn't absorbed, it's still being worked on, but there was a connection globally of people, and you could literally rattle off literally anybody in the world, right? And we knew each other. And we were teaching in certain institutions that were all connected, right?
Yeah.
And we were giving lectures globally, so when we're starting our careers, luck of the draw, we're being asked to lecture in Tokyo.
And look at the draw, they were Berlin 7
It's no longer in Los Angeles, and we came from the case study. Again, those of you that are in architecture, it was a very kind of powerful group of architects taking place, mostly with the residential territory that come from Schindler and Neutra, and we were already well aware of a kind of a high level of architecture thinking, but it was provincial, and we watched that provinciality disappear, and then we were resisting the generation in front of us for sure, right? Because we were now just by nature, we didn't ask for it, it just took place. We were living in a global environment, and that had a huge amount to do with all of the specificity that you're rattling off of the various kind of things that are being talked about that are now forming the architecture, and it's exploding, right? And we're connecting different dots.
And the intellectual transaction was not happening within big firms, but happening primarily
Little tiny starving firms.
Yeah, and also
Yes.
in academia, and so there was a lot of flow interchange between. There were kind of capital cities, each of which had schools where a lot of this happened. All that has shifted now because of the internet. Those dialogues are not necessarily based in the school or in the cities. So there's huge dispersive thing that's.
But this spirit, whatever you want to call it, became something more than drawings on paper. It became buildings, the buildings that we see in the images behind us, the buildings that we're familiar with. We here downtown. There's two Frank Gehry's. There's the Disney Concert Hall, and then there's the whatever they're calling the thing right next door.
The Grand.
There's Tom. There's the Caltrans building. So within walking distance of where we are perhaps three examples, living examples of three-dimensional, the reality of a kind of, is it an argument? I don't know, or is it?
Well, you have to,
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at Disney Hall.
Yeah,
Frank was many, many years in trying to get it built because the construction industry said, no, impossible, forget it, right? There was no receptivity here in Los Angeles at all.
right. They spent all the money on the garage at first.
They did, and so
on
it
the
wasn't until he
on the
was in this
drawings,
little
yeah.
backwater of Bilbao, kind of messy industrial town, and maybe they were naive, maybe they didn't know what they were really getting
Didn't know any
into,
better.
Maybe they had the Guggenheim
Maybe
behind
they
them.
had the Guggenheim, exactly. And this thing materialized. And
It was it was a boat building culture with people who knew how to construct with a computer.
and curvilinear
Yeah.
metal shapes
Yeah.
for boats.
Boats, yeah.
So it was a perfect marriage.
And this was designed before that. It was going to be originally
It
out
sat,
of
in, sat in the fridge.
just
for
sat, yeah,
about 8
just
years.
sat there. That's right. And it wasn't going to be clad in titanium either.
I remember sitting on a plane with Frank going Monterey, I think it's a small plane, and he was reading a progressive architecture, and they were featuring Bilbao, and his plans for Disney were in the fridge. And at that point, we didn't really know. We had a parking structure, and that was
Yeah.
it. And he said, well, what do you think? Maybe they'll build it one
You know what,
day."
it took somebody
Sweet.
like Richard Kashalik, actually, who I think deserved a little more recognition.
He's
because
supposed to be in the audience. Richard, are you here? Oh, he
Oh,
pinked out.
anyway, because Tom's building wouldn't be there downtown if it weren't for Richard.
Yeah.
And for Disney Concert Hall, they built a walk-in replica
Right.
of the concert hall interior
Yeah, it
and
used
put
to
it
be
on
parked
Grand
here.
Avenue
Yeah.
so that you could walk over and get up
24
inside
hours
it.
a day it was open.
It was. And so this kind of showmanship
Yeah.
and a certain amount of daring to make something happen takes a Richard Kashalik or whoever the guy is at the Guggenheim or
Yeah.
now.
Was.
Friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what did the form, I mean, clearly Disney Hall arrives and it is not the building you expect to be at the top of this, I don't know what we call the civic space up here, directly across the street from Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, which is, what is that? Hollywood Regency meets something else in the way of.
Meets Lincoln Center.
Yeah, meets
Lincoln Center.
Lincoln
Well,
Center, yeah.
Something happened in the 80s. We've talked thus far about the kind of philosophic strata out of which grew ideas and the connectivity of ideas, and how one area of endeavor inspires another, and people are living in the present, they're doing what they can do, they're inventing things. And somewhere in the very early 80s, and maybe Tom or Craig were familiar earlier, but for us and people I knew in the early 80s, all of a sudden there were computers and there were software programs. And so there was a tremendous sort of steroidal shot to what you could actually do. And of course, the story of Disney Hall is getting access to the CATIA system, right, from France. So you could begin to describe these things. It's very interesting to talk to Mortensen, the contractor, about how they interfaced, because in Frank's telling, he did all of the drawings, all the constructability drawings, there's a shop drawing phase and some other things, so that it could be built from his CATIA model. I don't know where the truth is in that. Mortensen has their view, but the fact is that we all had capabilities that we never imagined that began to emerge in the early 80s, and then they just exponentially went up. And we were talking earlier, we were amusing ourselves, talking about early renderings, people who painted images of our buildings to help people communicate them. And pretty soon, those folks had winnowed away, and you couldn't find them because you could just go to the computer and create, a lifelike three-dimensional image. You could rotate it, you could animate it.
But in Frank's case and in Zaha's case and almost everybody else's case, the vision came before the computer. The vision wanted the computer, but it didn't generate the vision.
We were talking about handwork and painting and its influence, and that was definitely a manual, tactile skill. But I just meant that once the computer and the software capability came in, it just super blew it.
We were
Yeah,
talking
exponential.
earlier about the Eiffel Tower,
Yep.
and I don't know how many of you ever saw the working drawings for the Eiffel Tower,
No.
but it was widely published at that time. And each strut, curved and warped, was described in an individual drawing. Just astonishing.
Then it had to be fabricated.
And then a fabricator had to pound on a piece of steel to make that. So I kind of dispute the idea that the reason we can do this,
Yeah.
it's an act of will rather than
That's
an
right.
act of pushing a button.
Oh, for
And
sure.
I think we really lack that will together. We were talking about students being on fire with their project and just wanting to pursue it to the very end. And we see very little of that today.
Well, is that, because, I think it found its way into the buildings that we see. The buildings that, Joseph is describing as an avant-garde, which really is, that's maybe too embracing a term. But when you look at the buildings, you begin to get the notion that, in fact, yes, they are transgressive. Yes, they are redefining space, not just interior space, but the space of the city itself. And, you can look at all the pictures in the book, you can look at all the pictures on the screen. You have to occupy those buildings, you have to live in them and live with them to begin to see the way in which they are shifting our perception of what it means to be in that place, in that moment. I think that's what you guys were driving at. Otherwise, you would have just made another Neo-Palladian or, a neoclassical structure.
You're just looking at possibility, but discussing building, this isn't the place it happens, LA, and this isn't the country it happens. If you zip around the world today, if you're looking at just innovation, forget radical, just innovative buildings, you're going to find all of it in other places. And it's going to be hard-pressed to find too much of it in this country. It's really an odd thing going on right now. But anyway, Corbusier, when he was working on the UN, said he couldn't work with Americans that were too timid. And obviously got the boot when Harrison was already attached to Rockefeller, and it was business as usual. It's business, right? And but we were just happened to be away for a month in Europe. And when you're away for a longer period of time, it's really startling. You come back and you feel like you're in a second world culture, literally. And you were saying in Lyon, looking at Wolf's museum.
Absolutely.
It'd be absolutely impossible to even think of even presenting that to. I had no client to present it to in this country.
Yeah.
They're just not interested in anything that's not forward-thinking, just current.
It wasn't so easy for him to build that. There was a lot of opposition.
Of course there was.
Oh, of course it was.
Of course.
Yeah,
but we could do our whole thing and rattle off 1 million buildings, and they're all going to be in China, or they'll be in various parts of Europe. And I remember seeing, who's doing the museum at the MAD?
Oh, yeah.
This beautiful form building, you're shaking your head, and I'm looking at it, it's in Mongolia. And I remember, just after that, I was on a jury with him at SC, going, damn. I mean, I couldn't imagine showing that to anybody in this country, and you're in Mongolia. But it's really, if you're interested in architecture, just looking at it globally, like we look at anything, right? It's kind of startling right now. We're in a weird period.
It is the beauty of working abroad, because their model for what you can do and you can't do, and what is assumed as protocol and not, are completely different than here.
Yeah.
And you have tremendous opportunities to reconstruct the idea of a building.
And in most places, it's still seen as a symbol of the contemporary. You're building a symbol of living in the 21st century.
So, but what does that mean? Because I think, it's interesting to me in Joseph's book, he talks a lot about the integration of the computer, but not in the way that you're talking about, Scott, more as the computer begins to do things for you that allow you to pursue your vision of a building. But it makes me wonder, because, we're sort of in this weird stasis in the United States, who I'm not going to try to explain it. I don't think any of us can explain it. But there seems to be a wide acceptability of the sort of architecture we're speaking about by very powerful, moneyed interests. We either in China, like I think, like REM's CCTV, the Mobius strip building, which I can't decide, are we supposed to like that thing or fear that thing? And when I look at that, I think, well, this is perhaps one of the most repressive, long-standing repressive regimes in the world, and yet it embraces the very architecture that Joseph is speaking of as avant-garde, as anti-authoritarian, as being opposed to the top-down.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I find there's a tension here, And Tom's making faces at me because he's working in China.
It's a little simplistic, I have to tell you. It's
Okay, well,
a
tell
little
us
more
why.
gray than that. It's not any more black and white, and it's the communist regime. And you can make a case just the opposite, by the way. And if you're talking about urbanism, if you're talking about city making, you've got a really difficult problem. The problem is here much more than it is in China. It's a much more complicated conversation that it's not we're going on this one for sure. But it's not good guys, bad guys. I mean, that's absurd.
I don't mean it that way.
He's
I'm
not
just
being
saying
evil
that
character building this
the
building.
architecture can become representative or, you know, can embody a different spirit than Joseph is speaking about.
I
It can
deeply
be
believe,
representative.
I
of that.
deeply believe that space shapes mentalities. And I was in an apartment, very luxurious apartment on Park Avenue with a German ambassador, the whole deal about 2 months ago. It was a musical evening. And I felt just awful, I must say, because the layout of this, it was Jackie Kennedy's father's building. He developed it, Art Deco, 720 Park. Anyway, so a top floor penthouse, but it was so ritualized that every room was part of the ritual of that time. And having written this book and having experienced these kind of spaces, I just felt deeply uncomfortable because the space was telling me how to behave.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
and I just kind of hated it. Zaha did a building in Baku, Azerbaijan, which sort of looks like a floppy hat to a certain extent. She teased a flat grid, a Cartesian grid, and pulled it up, and it became very mountainous, and the spaces inside were very fluid. Just down the block is a Stalinist building called Government Center, I believe. And so you couldn't have a deeper spatial contradiction than those two buildings, which the one down the block was a four-poster building, Stalinist, everything rigidly held in order, classicized vocabulary, and Zaha's, the space inside was liquid space, basically. She really achieved her goal of creating a different kind of a space. So I'm being toured. I can't walk through the space myself because this is a repressive culture and it's still a Stalinist carryover. Head honcho directs the government. He's the big guy. And so I can't walk through the space alone because I have to be tended. And so this guy is telling me what to think in this space. It's all about free thinking. And he doesn't get it. But the point is, and then I ask to be left alone, and so he follows me, so I walk alone to gather my own thoughts. But the point is kind of an object lesson. It's possible that this is a paradigm into which he's going to grow, or the culture is going to grow, and it's also charismatic when people want to get married. They're photographed in front of the building, so they know it's something special. So there's a seed of a new way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And when Zaha she was still alive, obviously, bringing the building out, she made sure there were separate inaugurations. One was the official one, which involved the president, his wife, and the whole family, and hers, which was purely architectural. So she really didn't want to be associated with a repressive regime. So it's sticky, So this is a regime that hired her for reasons that. So when the regime wants to show the Pope when he comes in, they show this building. So it's an icon. It's on stamps. It's all over the internet. But and some people, the people who are getting married, they kind of get it. One way of saying it, I want to hear more from you guys than from me, but I rented a car once in one of the Carolinas, and so I go to the desk and this woman, I'm now a New Yorker, and this woman behind the desk is incredibly friendly, and I think, what does she want? But she keeps on. I sign a contract. She's still friendly. So we say goodbye, and then I take the contract out to the car, drive the car to the gate, and there's a woman at the gate. This is a 30-second transaction, but she manages to be incredibly friendly, just like the woman inside. And how much of a conversation can you get out of giving a contract? But she manages to, say some nice things, and I feel welcome in this city. And as I drive out, I think, what's wrong with this picture? I thought, oh yeah, I'm a New Yorker. I've become a box. I live in a box room, in a box apartment, in a box building, on box streets, and they're still on a porch. Their minds are on a porch and talking to their neighbors on a street. So the point is, the space shapes you, whether you know it or not. And these buildings are all about liberation. They not all, but most of them. And the liquidity of space is something that's new that comes with these buildings. it's the space between if you look at the cover again, it's the space between that matters perhaps more than the forms, but the forms make that space possible.
For the most
Yeah.
part, actually, there's a generosity
Yes,
that I feel when I'm in any of the buildings we're talking about, Bilbao or whatever, even Maxi in Rome. You have long sight lines, you have a kind of tease that there might be something around the next corner. You have a kind of sense of drama and of evolution. It makes you alive. It makes you feel very
it piques your
energized.
curiosity. You want to
It
see what's
does,
next.
it does,
And
it
it
actually
doesn't
does.
doesn't give you a terminal point to say this is what next.
Yeah, now I've arrived.
But it's interesting, a huge amount of the stuff in this book terrifies people.
Yes.
It frightens you. I would have said, my experience, and I learned it very young, and then I'm producing work that I just thought was natural and obvious. And it frightened people. And all of a sudden, they start connecting you to being kind of a disruptor, because you're a frightening character.
But
You're
in a-
producing
in a
things that are
negative,
scaring
it's a
people.
pejorative
And I
thing.
never could have understand that. I think the first reading is, I would have a different opinion. I think in most cases, it's not something that's familiar. And the less it's familiar to some known typology, we're creatures of habit. All of us are creatures of habit. It's a degree thing, right? It frightens people. And architecture as an art form it's its most difficult problem because you have to live with it, right? A painting you can finally get rid of or trade or turn it upside down and put it someplace, right? But I would have said most of I don't know, I mean, people are architects here or who the audience is, but it'd be really interesting your response, because I tend to look at this and go, oh my God, you're going to turn these guys loose.
But
right?
I mean,
They're very dangerous.
you're absolutely right, Tom. I mean, that is, I think, what happens. You look at the building, and it is, at some level, it's not comprehensible from your experience.
Oh, so it makes you feel insecure, you
Yep.
think?
Well, there are words like oblique, which might be value neutral, roughly, and then there are words like transgressive, which are pretty value laden, right?
Yeah.
And deconstruct. Joseph does a whole thing on French linguistic philosophers. which
Yeah.
I thought that period was over, but because he's doing a historic story, it was a very important part of the story. And we won't maybe go into that, but it is a super important part of what happened, particularly in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Chaos theory is more important, actually.
Yeah, yes. But I was just saying the word deconstruct, if you just take it for what we think it might mean, and take it out of the 1988 MoMA, and take it out of the magazines, you deconstruct something in very simplistic terms as architects. It seems valuable to deconstruct. Lyotard talked about destroying something before you build something back. And so deconstructing in the way that I'm using it means take apart all the normal assumptions, and then you have to put something back for it, right? We have to, if you're doing an architectural proposition, you have to give something that someone will appreciate or learn from, or there will be some presumed benefit from for what you took apart, right? I'm using the word in a slightly different way than Joseph meant it, but I've always, and in this town I don't have to say it, it's more than obvious, but I've always enjoyed Frank Gehry's work because he resists doing the kind of the easy or the common thing, right? A wall could do this, but it's not going to do that. A roof could be sloped to drain, but it won't do that. There might be an expected way you'd think the structural frame would come together, but he's not going to do that. So he forces you to sort of evaluate all of these changes, and you have to then say, well, is this interesting? Am I taking something away from this that's extraordinary or better than when I arrived or whatever? So I think that, again, isolating the term deconstruct, you also have to say, well, what am I getting for the effort to take it apart?
Well, you're getting surprise, you're getting delight, you're getting animation, you're getting energy, you're getting all kinds of positive terms. I remember first venturing into Frank's house and noticing that the driveway floor, which was asphalt, was the dining room, right? And then you look at that and you say, well, actually that's okay. That's okay. That doesn't seem transgressive. It just seems okay. Well, it's kind of a picnic on the driveway in the dining room. I mean, it has many overtones.
What's wrong with this kitchen ceiling here?
Well, exactly, and I think that those kind of revelatory moments are very precious. I think they're very, very
We don't
precious.
get enough of them.
We don't get
don't
enough of
diet.
it in our culture. We don't get enough of it in our daily habits. It's just something lacking, and I think that's maybe, to Tom's point about why things aren't happening in Los Angeles, has to do with the culture generally not having enough of that. We're in a kind of synthesized everything, very highly ordered, very highly marketed, very highly, strategically positioned, but not necessarily give us a positive experience.
And in New York, there are tons of people with extraordinary art collections, contemporary art collections, but in terms the architecture is very frequently in a traditionalized context, and for some reason they don't connect the dot between contemporary architecture and contemporary art and contemporary architecture. Not with Frank's, that house is interesting because if you think of it as, it bothered the neighbors, but if you actually think of it as a combine, an artistic combine of that time, which I think was the direct inspiration for what he did, then you think, oh, he's just applying art to architecture, and that's what's transformative about it. It's very simple kick to the side.
Gordon Matta Clark, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Gordon Matta Clark obviously as well, but and that was there was a whole art movement called destruction art at that time as well, which they had to attack. What they're basically doing is taking apart the syntax of these complete, thoughts, architectural thoughts, and reorganizing these parts into different configurations, into different syntax. So it's a reinvention of syntax. And with Zaha's buildings, I am doing a biography of Zaha, and so I'm interviewing a lot of her architects, and they don't use the usual words. They actually have their own words for what they're doing, whether it's feathering, which is called whooshing, or tick-tick, which is called objects, and it means something else as well. And they're kind of pet words, but everybody knows what they mean, and they just do it, and it's not... Rem did a show at the Biennale on the elements of architecture, and I thought it was very regressive because he was basically taking the elements of architecture, and each of them, there might be a historical one or a modern one, but a door was a door, a window was a window, and that's all changed with this architecture altogether. As a writer, I have recourse for my metaphors primarily to nature, because if you talk about canyons and waterfalls and cliffs, and that helps give the reader an idea of what you're walking through. It's not that the architects themselves, Tom, you can answer this, it's not that you're thinking of nature, but nature is the richest source of words that I can describe buildings that have superseded the architectural vocabulary.
So where do you think it's going? Because, Tom, you're talking about in the United States, we're moribund. I mean, maybe that's a nice way of putting it. The work you do, maybe that's true for Scott and you too, Craig.
Actually,
don't
I
know.
brought that up because it hasn't come up yet, that this is one of the places in the world that's understood as a think tank. And that you could go any place in the world and they'll name LA as a think tank. And there's just a disconnect between the think tank and the building, the building of those
It's
things.
not realized.
And well, this guy could talk forever on it.
Yeah.
The number of people here with this extraordinary kind of thinking that have repositioned architecture that's part of this. And there's new generations that are ditto. And they have learning institutions which are both actually part of the late 60s, UCLA 68, SIARC 72, that added to the oldest single institution, right? And that there's a symbiotic there, and literally anybody producing architecture or thinking about architecture shows up here to lecture. You know that, right? Mm-hmm. And and so for me, if I'm disappointed, or it's really difficult for me to constantly kind of watch a culture that doesn't even understand its own position at that level, but it is architecture, and it's a very, I guess, esoteric kind of territory, so I'm not sure what I can say about it. It just exists. But it is important to understand that the rest of the world sees this place, right? In terms of a think tank, it's there. And is that going to change?
Well, I think the question is architecture necessarily a mirror of that? In other words, the sort of creative impulses, the story writing, the scenography, the technical expertise out at the Caltech, et cetera, those are in their own orbits. You did a building at Caltech and, tried to kind of pin that zeitgeist there. I don't know what the reception of the scientists was, but it's a great presence on the street. And it says, well, Caltech isn't all about, columns and arcades and so forth and so on. So it is in a certain way disruptive, but in a polite way. Well, sorry. Maybe Tom thought it was really, kind of.
I'm a conservative architect. Of course.
But I do think that the idea that the culture automatically generates structures that mirror its values is probably a false premise. I do. I think, you find that things that naturally propagate throughout the world, movies, technical programs, computer programs, et cetera, they propagate. And architecture stands still. It's not going anywhere. And so it doesn't become familiar to anyone except people like all of us who look at pictures of buildings and get some satisfaction out of that. But unless you've actually been there, which is a dribble, it doesn't amount to a kind of.
Well, LA has a
Social
particular
pressure.
problem because it's such a domesticated environment, i.e. houses. There is a privatized world that's partially dependent on resale value. So you don't particularly want to go too weird because you might not be able to sell it. In addition to which, Los Angeles is not particularly institutionally strong and prolific. There are not all that many institutions. It's not particularly civic in terms of aggregations of, except for this particular area downtown. There's not a civic, it's very dispersed. And so there's no, the frequency of concentrated areas where a civic building might have a certain presence of value to the public. It's just, so LA is dispersed and it doesn't collect people. The spaces don't collect people. So I think you have a lot of issues that do not predispose the city to the architecture we're talking about, or in any civic architecture, because mortgages and few institutions, there's just not many. Actually.
It goes back to kind of if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
there
I-
isn't the
I
spirit
grew
of
up-
philanthropy here either to,
What?
there isn't the spirit of philanthropy here to support any of those forms. And they're not interested for the most part.
We're a very disaggregated, in America in general, we're a very disaggregated country and support system. Los Angeles typifies that. Maybe in the extreme, it's disaggregated. Obviously, politically, we're extremely disaggregated. Culturally and in terms of capital, we are. So it's hard to build the centralized support that we see in China when we're working in China, or even in Europe, frankly, their historical support for things. I think your question about going forward, one of the questions that interests me is, will we continue to be obsessed by singular heroic architecture, or will, in fact, in the next couple of generations, the social and cultural narratives become so compelling, the environmental narratives become so compelling, that in fact, architecture will take, maybe it's a left turn, I don't know, whichever way it is, but take a turn or open up to solving, addressing those problems, and become subsumed more into infrastructure, environmental remediation, whole set of other things, or will we forever hold on to the idea of the singular act, the heroic, isolated object?
But I don't think those have to be opposed. And
It's possible.
I mean, I would hope they don't have to be opposed, that you can have invigorating, energizing, all the things we think of that we associate with the kind of architecture we've been talking about, not really seeing, but talking about. It doesn't have to mean that that disappears because, what's on the horizon is,
Sure.
a better
We think
system
of
for
what
watering
young
your
architects
lawn.
will be
or
doing.
whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I think that the architecture that is presented in the book is in some way misunderstood by people who, let me say in a different way, the architecture that's presented in the book is quite capable because it's all about open systems and opening to various logics that almost all those architects have absorbed, and Tom, you can confirm this for me, the ecological argument. I know in Zaha's firm, when they do a competition, they have their eco department that jumps on the brief, and the ecological issues, the environmental issues, are integrated into the design, which is one of the reasons they win so frequently. They're not ignoring these issues, and so this kind of architecture does not preclude smart infrastructure, social issues, political issues, environmental issues. Is by its very nature very open, and to the idea that we have to become Puritans and do only serious infrastructure, all that. Cities are always going to need inflection points. The spirit goes to something that's unusual and perhaps idiosyncratic, that treats you differently, as invites your imagination, that creates a sense of wonder, or as what's his name said, architecture is commodity, firmness and delight. The delight thing is always going to be very, very important.
Right.
And that's why Disney Hall across the street is a good example. I mean, other than Tom's building, a couple of other buildings around here, there are few buildings around here that are actually delightful. And it really, I'm fresh from Paris, and I'm really astounded at the public nature of even bland buildings, because they all open up at the street, many of them with cafes open up on the street, so that what we think of as our monopoly on inside-outside living is true, had always been true of Paris, where there are inside-outside cafes, and it's just, it's really makes you hope for a more urbanized Los Angeles, actually.
Well, that comes with some of what we were talking about at lunch about LA's infrastructure, which in many ways offers tremendous challenges to having a kind of urban experience, and to buildings helping to reinforce that urban experience, because the building is essentially controlled by an unfriendly pedestrian grid, unfriendly access to the building through parking, et cetera, so that at least one of the sort of layers of answers to the questions of why don't we have more great architecture, I think lies right there.
Well, I'm going to stop it here, Craig. Thank you. Only because we want to take a few questions from the audience, you guys willing. And so they've got microphones. If you can, there's a gentleman here. Oh, sorry.
So, since this event is being lectured, would I kindly ask everyone to get something on the mic? We're asking the question, just so everyone can hear. And you said there was a gentleman over here?
Here in the black shirt and a red mask. Huh?
No profanity.
No, am I supposed to say that?
No. No. It's
Hello. First of all, thank you all for this very inspiring and meaningful discussion and discourse. And congratulations, Joseph, for this really insightful piece of work. I'm Abdullah Tahsin. I'm a recent graduate from SciArc, from the MArc2 program at SciArc, and a student of Eric Moss and Dwayne Oder. And I noticed that, Joseph, you have a chapter in the book titled Drawing, Dwelling, and Phenomenology. So I was brought up into architecture really inspired by this phenomenological or post-phenomenological thinking. And I was wondering if any of it could basically chip into this disruptive avant-garde framework. This experience-based design, how we could think about perception of space and senses, and how if we could incorporate that into a formless building where the inside and outside could basically meaningfully interact together and discreetly enforce one another. I want to hear from you, what's your thoughts if this could actually be possible? Because Peter Eisman once said, an architect could either be an abstractionist or a phenomenologist.
He said it's either what?
An architect can either be an abstractionist or a phenomenologist. He can't be both, or they can't be both.
Did you hear that?
So I was wondering,
Did you say phenomenologist?
phenomenologist,
PH.
Yeah.
Phenomenologist.
phenomenologist,
Can you hear?
abstractionist, or a phenomenologist.
None of us here could hear it.
Yeah, so I
Can
was
you
wondering.
take your mask off, actually?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Don't ask the whole question again, please.
So I was wondering, in your view, if a post-phenomenological or a phenomenological approach could be incorporated in this avant-garde disruptive thinking. And, Peter Eisman once said, an architect can either be a phenomenologist or an abstractionist. So in his view, it's pretty much detached. I
Yeah.
was wondering, in your view, if
Well, first of all, Peter never says anything that's not in his own philosophical self-interest. And so I would take it with a big grain of salt. And he is he's an enemy of phenomenology, even though phenomenology feeds directly into deconstruction. And there's no, they're really quite related. And almost all the architects here are either card-carrying phenomenologists or effectively phenomenologists, because it's all about experience. It's not necessarily about language, but language can be about experience. I once told Peter that I felt, physically in his building at Wexner Center at Ohio State, that I found it quite thrilling physically because he has shifted grids, and I felt that walking from one grid to another was like taking a step off a dock onto a boat, that it was a change of state, and also physically too. The great accomplishment of that building was he built a scaffold which he tilted, and he therefore took the vanishing point off the horizon line, which was a really radical thing to do. And so it kind of shifts your whole perception. It acts on you. You don't know where you are quite. So even though this was a so-called deconstructed building, it actually was quite phenomenological. In addition to which, the building was started after he read chaos theory, which predates his interest in deconstruction. And so his application of deconstruction was retroactive. And so, which means, Peter is kind of an idea surfer. He surfs ideas for a while, then he gets the next wave. And so he's not a sincere intellectual. He's a provocative intellectual. He uses ideas to inform and dislocate his architecture, but it doesn't necessarily mean he bases his buildings on the architecture.
All right, well, let's hope Peter's not in the audience out here.
Hey, he will definitely tune in.
Yeah, touche, yes.
But Joseph, he did, through a process, stumble onto a bunch of accidental relationships, which are very stimulating, at Wexner.
Oh, I see, yes.
I mean, it was an analytic process.
It's an interesting building, absolutely. I'm not saying, but perhaps not for the reasons that Peter said.
I think so, too.
All right, so we'll take another question from this gentleman here.
I've had your book about 2 days, Joseph, so I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I've enjoyed, like Tom said, thumbing through it overnight. So anyway, you said you began writing it between 1988 and 92, and then maybe took a pause.
Can you hold the microphone?
Oh, yeah, you began writing it between 88 and 92 and then took a pause. So my question simply is, what inspired you to come back to finish it, and was there a specific goal in mind?
Well, in my view, the first version of the book was finished in 1992, and it took a huge amount of effort because I had to earn a living in the meantime, and my life was very complicated. And then I finished it, and then I had a meeting with an editor who's still around, and who told me to put the book in chronological order, as I said. So I immediately realized she didn't understand the book. I couldn't work with her, and I couldn't put it in chronological order because there was no chronology to it. There was, as Tom implied, it was stochastic. There were the influences here and here, and to kind of tease out some chronology, some narrative from a time point of view was really impossible. So I put it on the shelf. I was exhausted. And my life went in a different direction, and I had other things to do. And I brought it off the shelf about 20 years later. It coincided with a move, and I sat down with it, as I said, and I'm repeating myself a little bit. And I liked it, and I thought it was valuable because nobody else had written about this whole thing. The problem with this work is it's very splashy. So you get a journalist, maybe even a critic, who tries to make a sense out of one building, and nobody had put it all together. And so this book had done this, but when I came back to it, the whole thing had moved had evolved, it had rooted, it was becoming bigger, the Bilbao effect had happened, so the stuff proliferated, and then of course the computer took it somewhere else. So I had 20 years, more than 20 years to catch up on, and by this time, I felt the term deconstructivism had been sort of overused and abused by the Johnson show, which really infuriated me. It was a stolen idea. He didn't understand it. He misportrayed it. So I decided, I realized too that this phenomenon in the 70s and 80s was part of a much longer phenomenon. So I not only brought it forward, but I took it back to the 19th century. And so I put it in a larger context because it is a contextual kind of work, because so much of the thinking, let's say inspiration and some of the thinking, comes out of the teens and 20s, whether it's the Russians or the Germans, and it happens, that thinking, that disruptive thinking, happens in architecture. The Second World War interferes, and it sort of lands in the 60s again. Anyway, but it's part of a much longer century, so that's why I call it a century of the disruptive avant-garde. I didn't, it would have been published in 1992. It wasn't, and I'm just as happy that a work that kind of predicted what would happen successfully and accurately came to pass, and so I was just able to change the tenses of the verbs. It was not future tense, it's now past tense, so it became a history. It's a history with a future as well, because the notion of the avant-garde is that the avant-garde, I mean, you're not resting on your laurels. You're not just doing stuff that you did 20 years ago. The avant-garde is always going into new territory, and to explore, to figure out, to discover what they don't know, basically. And so the people here are not going to, some of them are, but most of them are researchers and inventors, and that's the spirit of the avant-garde, and that's where it's going to go, and we don't know quite where it's going to land.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, go right ahead.
Joseph, I may have the perfect segue for you. First, I have read the book. It's wonderful. It's a great contribution, and I appreciate all our panelists who are terrific. My question is whether the disruptive, transgressive nature that you're pointing to in breaking the grid and all that, whether it's really run its course. Still, we see buildings in the latest work that are out of the grid, but they more and more lack the dangerous, disruptive, sort of objecting kind of crash that you see, whether it's the exploding organ in Disney Hall, or it's any number of buildings that seem like they're forms in collision, or where the buildings are so out of balance you think they're going to fall on you. Think of the Denver Art Museum. What we see now, it seems to me, is stuff that owes more of a debt to Brancusi than to Joel Shapiro. The work has become, especially as you look at Zaha Hadid and her office's work, highly expressionist, as the other work was, but highly fluid, not colliding. I think you even used that word of liquid with that work, and it's not only hers. I don't see the kind of crash and burn of the transgressive work of 10 years ago. And after all, Joan, it may be that the avant-garde that you've identified is no longer the avant-garde, which is where you were just a moment ago. Jean Moreau said there is no avant-garde, there's only a rear guard.
Well, any comments?
Well,
Go ahead, Craig.
Focus on disruption.
Dive
yeah,
in
just
there.
in
It's no longer a surprise.
maybe superficial way, but what you're talking about, Barry, I think is that the forms become more like industrial forms. They become more like Jaguars and Lamborghinis, and they lack the sort of interior juxtapositions that provoke and reward kind of interrogation, and that the ultimate smoothing of things, which is Patrick Schumacher's whole deal, is self-defeating, I feel, because it does homogenize the work and creates the work. I actually, Zaha's building in Korea, I experienced the building as kind of landscape, more than as an object, as a setting, as opposed to an energy field. And the narrative experience of the building was far more about surfaces and wanting to touch it. Really wanted to touch it and caress it as you would an automobile at a concours d'elegance. Had that quality, which I think is, as Barry's saying, something very, very different than her fire station or buildings which are more discontinuous and not quite so harmonious.
Maybe we should do a Jacques Derrida with Barry's question here. I didn't see that, but I understand what you're saying as you say it, Craig. Maybe what Barry means is that psychically we've seen the destruction or the deconstruction or the explosion of the transgression, you know, of architecture as it was before, and maybe we've been shocked and we're post-shock.
Well, who are the we, though? I mean, the we, you know, it's, how many
Well, the we
angels?
is me.
Yeah,
Of course, the we is me.
Which is more than enough.
exactly. I mean,
What more do we need? But no, but at what point, how do you react to that? I mean, what is the next thing that will emerge? We probably nobody knows this question, the answer to this question, but that will emerge that will take us to a new layer, the way that this has explosively taken us.
But it isn't just about shock, because
Of course not.
you know, you can smash your guitar. That's not the point. I don't think.
Well,
I hope it's not
find
the
a
point.
lower caliber word if shock is scary.
Well-
Find something else. But the point is, it's let's say disruptive.
Of
Disruptive
It
in
has
a
nothing to
dramatic
do
way.
with
Yeah,
shock.
no, I'm not saying it does. I'm saying that's the point.
Totally
is-
disinterested in shock. It has to do with a conclusion, a concretization of a thought process that led you there. And the thought processes are going to have to be extremely diverse because we operate within a heterogeneous global community. And so there'd be no possibility of any kind of a singularity, because the first question would be, who's aesthetic? I think that one of the conversations that didn't come up here, I think there's an incredible over-investment in the look of something. Absurd.
yeah.
You could look at, you're going to choose to, we're going to argue about this thing or these. Absurd. We have to find something more substantial that we argue about, that we find our connectivity, right? As a culture, or cultures, right? And to focus on the look, we need more characters, we need more critics can talk about this that aren't, for me in San Francisco, a lot of people thought it was hideous. They didn't discuss the fact we put a child care center there. We'd done research that half the people were women and they now had their children. We didn't talk about, we put a piazza there. They wanted a big building. We fought like hell. We reversed this work structure. The workers, the staff on the outside with you, the management in the middle, on and on. No one talks about that. The first tall building in the United States that didn't use air conditioning. We took it out completely, right? That's the conversation we can agree upon. And I remember when Nancy Pelosi had her office there, she didn't like it. She wanted a Victorian or something, right? and metal panels. And I'm going, well, but it powers a town of 600 people, right? And we did the thing I'm talking about. Do you still feel that way? It'd be like looking at some odd thing. You look at a particular, a chopper or something, and you decide you're gonna appreciate it as you know more about the nature of the thing. Well, for me, it was the lunar landing module. and you see it, and it's phenomenal, right? And you look at it, it's just really odd. And is it an aesthetic thing? Yes or no, right? The more you know about it, the more you understand it aesthetic. It's visual nature. You understand based on the nature, the uniqueness of this thing. It had to go 3/4 of a million miles one way back, et cetera. And again, I think there's way too much we'll never agree on that. There's completely no possibility of agreement. It's a total waste of time to operate at that level. We have to finally look at this, the more important things of what buildings, how they operate environmentally, socially, politically, culturally, and that's what we have to agree upon. And then we can, in fact, if anything, appreciate, in this city, for me, it's Mr. Moss. You can disagree with the building or not. I look at it, do I agree or disagree? It's irrelevant. Or do I like the building, the way it looks? I look at it as a free spirit operating under intelligent conditions, producing something that has kind of clear kind of ideas of how it operates in various ways. And it doesn't matter whether I like the way it looks or not. In fact, if anything, cities need buildings that people don't like. Everybody wants it. There should be some weird things in there. They're just these odd things. It's called vibrant urbanism, right? That has that diversity and the collisions and the crashes and the things that don't make sense, but make sense in terms of the human character and has to do with our own subjective thinking and our own dislogic, the nature of who we are as human characters, right? Produce very complicated things, and it definitely isn't all rational. It has to do with the human character. And it'd be no different than Jimi Hendrix as he puts down his first chord, right? We do it in a different way. And we're already really limited. It can't leak, and it has to have heat conditions, and it has to withstand gravity. It's already so loaded with pragmatic stuff. It's impossible to be radical, to be an architect. If you really think you can be crazy, you absolutely don't understand architecture. Right?
You're actually in a combat zone. You're in a zone where you're doing combat with the codes, with the clients,
Exactly.
with prevention, et cetera, and you're pretty much alone.
Yes.
Pretty much alone, right?
For sure.
I would disagree with the vocabulary you used to describe this stuff, because I can't think of an architect who wanted to do a building that kind of crash and burns and that's done only for the startle effect. I would say instead that there's a desire to create spaces of wonder that fascinate. It's also subjective, but it's much more benign than the vocabulary that you use to describe it. I do think that some of these forms that, whether it's oblique or diagonal, have been absorbed within the field. I was going to the airport in Paris the other day. There was a huge building that was deconstructed, and I told my daughter, they didn't ask me what, it was a surprise to me, but so it's in the language. And perhaps it's not new. This is a big commercial building, many stories, tripartite, and it looked quite beautiful to my eye. Maybe Disney Hall irritated a lot of people at the beginning, but it's been absorbed. It's changed our aesthetic. It's now normalized. Frank and everybody else are going to different forms of exploration. So it's not that they've stopped, and it's certainly not kind of a cheap thrill architecture. It's hard to do. But a lot of buildings that are hard to do, like Gothic cathedrals or many exceptional buildings, were not usual. They're not obvious, I think there's maybe a surprise element. One is pleasantly astounded to a certain extent, but I don't think anybody is. None of this is cheap stuff. In terms of one's motivation, it's all. I think everybody in my book is really, really serious, and it's really.
That's why it's 813 pages long.
Yeah. I did an apartment in '88 where I had two clients, a couple, and she was contemporary, he was traditional, and So I basically did a hybrid apartment. It wasn't hybridized in terms of merged, but from certain points of view, if he sat here, he would see a traditional apartment. If she sat there, she would see a deconstructed apartment. But it was much harder to do the geometry and do the drawings for the deconstructed part than the classical part. The classical stuff just fell in place because it's all about hierarchies. So you determine the overall frame here, then everything devolves from the framework. It was so much easier.
So I don't know, maybe we have time for one more question, or should we call it quits? Yeah. You already had your chance, but there's somebody over there. Sorry, nothing personal.
We have a lady over
but spread the wealth as best we can, and this will be our last question. And you can come outside, and Joseph is going to sign some books.
Sure.
Yeah. So obviously we all agree with what you guys, I mean, most of the people here agree with what you're saying and all the, I myself, I worked for Eric many years. I love this, I love all of this. The problem, as I guess this question will go for Tom and everyone here, is what can change on the outside of architecture so that clients, the public, would be more receptive to idea architecture or art form architecture that we all want, but we basically can't convince a lot of clients to do in the United States, because it seems to me in Europe, just general public is more educated in art and architecture. So they do like different architecture, or they do allow that to happen in a democracy. And I guess in China, because they don't actually make the decision, whoever is making the decision is making that happen. But in the US, we do have a lot of money. I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, you have all the tech companies, but you don't see them wanting to spend or believing that much in architecture to allow these things to happen. So as you guys all practice, so that's my question. What do you think should happen? Is it the education of the public? Is it education of the client?
If you understand the question right, it's really interesting because I've heard this many times. Nobody ever discusses the Save-On drugstore on the corner. What the fuck? Wouldn't you start with that? If you drive down any street or an alley, it's one of the most hideously ugly cities.
Yeah, and they're
in the
all
world.
the same. Exactly.
It's hideous.
Yeah.
Right? My wife and I joke about it. When we're coming back from a travels, we're coming down Lincoln Boulevard to Santa Monica.
Oh yeah.
It's hilarious, and I understand it's Canal Street. That's what it is, right? But it's hilarious. Why doesn't anybody discuss that? And you look at something that people do agree with has aesthetic principles.
Right.
Various people, it could be 3% or 1%, I don't care, right? It's not important. It'd be more, I'd go back to the nature of how it operates in the world, environmentally and socially, and blah, 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 and how it operates. Again, nobody ever asks about Caltrans. It was built for $150 in 2 years, and it was the most inexpensive building. We put a double skin on it. It has to do with performance. It's kind of an ugly building. I think that's totally okay. It's just what it is, right? And I get stuck to have to do it after Frank that gets to do a really beautiful thing, and that's the idea, right? Every building, it doesn't have to be beautiful. It is just what it is based on the nature of a particular process, and there's huge inputs in that process, right, that the critics should be talking about. This is why it looks like it looks like. And by the way, a parking garage costs this. So how did these guys build this for a parking garage, right? I got a call from Frank on that. He's complimenting me, of all things, of how he did it. So listen, if anybody could build a building for nothing out of cardboard, it was Frank. And that was the best honor I ever got. And understood we built it for fucking nothing, right? But the point is, why don't we look at the rest of the 90, by the way, the 97% or the 98% of the stuff that's totally hideous, and also hideous in terms of its performances, right? In terms of kind of operates, and whether it's use of materials, whether it's environmental, whatever it is, right?
But Tom, I really think it's far broader than an idea of clients being receptive to your question. I think if you look back at the late 40s through the 60s, when John Lautner was designing these amazing drive-in restaurants, and the style of buildings, there's a Glendale Federal Building or Bank Building in Glendale, which is a really adventurous building. And there was an optimism, there was a sense that we're going somewhere, a sense of purpose in those buildings. That I think has just gone out of the realm of real estate development. real estate development is just about square feet.
No.
You can rent it, and you don't need to take that
Yeah,
next
yeah,
step.
I mean, the buildings, I know Lincoln really well, what you're talking. I'm sure everyone's driven down Lincoln. What, the interesting thing that, Tom, is if you were to go building by building, you might discover that there is some integrity to those buildings that at least is much greater than the incredibly crappy, I don't think they call it Save-On anymore, I don't know what, Walgreens that they are going to build when they tear one of those little mom and pop places down. And the truth is that at that level, our built environment is disintegrating. And what Craig is talking about is we're looking at, on Lincoln, we're looking at that disintegration. And then when they put in the Rexall or whatever it is, you're looking at the obliteration.
Well, those are built by national corporations.
Yeah, exactly.
That probably
They're-
never stood on the site.
Never.
Ever.
Neither did
They
the
don't-
architect.
Neither did the architect. It's
Yeah.
just-
But I mean, you're so right about that. And that is, to paraphrase Andre Malraux, what he said, the opposite of good writing is not necessarily bad writing. The opposite of good architecture is not necessarily bad architecture. It is just architecture. And that's what we're stuck with.
But it's not about it to begin with, it's a civil act.
Agreed. And they've abdicated. No interest.
So I guess the question is, how can you bring that value to?
We can't. We don't have the answer.
To be continued.
Yes.
Well,
We missed that.
We missed it.
Yeah, don't vote for Rick Caruso. There you go.
Believes that the Grove is a simulacrum of architecture. We need to believe that the political decisions we make and the pieces we support are an important part of our voice in this conversation of what our city can do.
Yes. Well, here.
Spoken like an architect.
Yeah.
Well, I think
We need to find someone interested in that, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Rick Caruso, here's your man. Well, we want to thank everybody today, my distinguished panel. Thank you all for coming out. I think Joe knows somewhere outside here we have a little reception. There are books to buy, sign. We can continue the conversation outside. And with that, we bid you adieu for now. Thanks.
Very well.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the whole thing. The first part of it.